Hello everyone and welcome to Decentralized Clinical Trials Digital Week, brought to you by the organisers of the Global Clinical Trials Europe event and content series. My name is Louisa Maitland and I'll be your host for today's session, which is titled Place Shifting, Leveraging Digitalization as Enabler of Hybrid and Remote Trials. First, I'll cover some quick housekeeping items. If you experience difficulties with audio or advancing slides, refresh your screen with F5. If you're experiencing other issues, hit the question mark button to receive assistance. At any time during the presentation, you can submit your questions into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen. In 24 hours, you'll receive a link to watch the recording of this session. You can also download a few featured articles in the resource list box on the right side of your screen. Let's now begin by introducing our speaker for the session, Bill Byrom, VP, Product Intelligence and Positioning, Signant Health. Thank you for joining us today, Bill. Now I'll hand it over to you to start the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks Louisa, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm just going to advance through to the next slide. There we go. So as Louisa said, I'm Bill Byrom, VP of Product Intelligence and also an eCOA scientist at Signant Health. And I'm going to provide a brief overview of the common technology components of DCTs. And when I do that, I'm going to also provide a few real-life examples of how we might use them. Then I'm going to look at measurement strategies. So in other words, how and when we measure things. So as we design our studies with this decentralization in mind. I'll then look specifically at novel endpoint development using wearables and sensors. And then finally, I'll touch briefly on two topics that are perhaps often overlooked. So first, the challenge of dealing with a growing number of data sources as we collect greater quantities of data remotely. And then secondly, what decentralization for the study monitor looks like as opposed to the patient. So first, let's look briefly at the common technologies used in decentralized trials today. Decentralization encompasses a spectrum of alternatives for how, when, and where patients can participate in a clinical trial. So we're not exclusively talking about fully siteless or fully remote trials, but we're talking about trials in which more elements of the study can be conducted away from the main site. So perhaps at home, or perhaps leveraging more local facilities. And the drive here is really all about making study participation more convenient for patients. So let's look at a few examples. And this first example is remote consenting using an electronic informed consent solution. So this study is a US-based study in which patients arrive at hospital, and when they arrive, they're actually incapacitated. They're unable to consent to participate themselves. And so in this case, remote access to the e-consent solution is provided via the web to a legally authorized representative who's able to review the materials on behalf of the patient, flag areas that need some clarification or discussion, and then discuss those in a telephone consultation with the investigator. Once that's done satisfactorily, the forms are then signed electronically by both parties, and then the patient is able to participate in the study. And you can obviously see in this use case, because of the type of patient that's been brought into the study, it'd be very hard to manage quickly and easily without a remote electronic informed consent. But I think you can also imagine how this would be useful in other studies where it might just simply be a more convenient process for the individual patient. Let's move to a second example, and this is one where medication is shipped direct to the patient at home, and this is done to limit the number of in-clinic visits needed. In this particular study, it was a pediatric trial in only a small number of patients, but this required injections on a daily basis for a number of weeks. And it was obviously deemed to be really quite inconvenient for the patient to attend clinic each time, every day, for those particular injections. And so the way it was conducted was, after the first few injections were done at site and they felt the patient was fine with the injections, the central pharmacy then took over and shipped the medication or the vials directly to the patient each day. And then at home, the medication was inspected and administered by a nurse who performed a home visit for that patient. So again, using actually a combination of direct-to-patient medication shipment and home visits by a healthcare professional to enable that level of decentralization, to provide a more convenient experience for the patient. Other studies require patients to provide various samples on a regular basis or on an as-needed basis. And these might include things like sputum samples or stool samples as an example. So in this case study, patients collected a stool sample at home when they needed to. And the ePro app, the patient reported outcomes app, the electronic diary that they were using to collect their symptoms data, also provided full instructions to them on how to collect the sample using the sample kit provided. But then once the patient had collected the sample, they could click on a button in the ePro app to request a courier to pick up that sample from their home. And behind the scenes, this would flag to the courier, who in this case would contact the patient directly, arrange a time and a location to collect the sample. And when collected, the courier could also provide a replacement kit for the next sample if needed. And finally, this example shows how oversight of at-home assessments can be enabled to ensure that measurements are made in a standardized manner and in accordance with the study protocol. So in this example, we have a home nurse who's attending a patient's home. It's a study in infants where we need to monitor the growth of infants over a period of time. And actually that growth, those growth measures were the primary endpoint in this study. And what the FDA wanted to make sure was to ensure that measurements were conducted accurately and in a standardized manner if they were to be done outside of the clinic, i.e. at these home nurse visits. And so in this solution, we provide video glasses for the home nurse to wear whilst they're doing the measurements. And this provides a hands-free video stream to the investigator or to a central medic so he can oversee and make sure that these things are done per protocol and in the standardized way required. So some nice examples perhaps illustrating aspects of decentralization. And I think sort of more generally, what are the common components of a decentralized trial? I think many of them are listed here on this slide. So I think most commonly, the ones that are ticked here in red, we see sponsors asking about things like e-consent, eCOA, which is clinical outcome assessment, so patient-reported outcomes are part of that, telemedicine, direct-to-patient medication provision, and linked with that often courier service integration when considering a decentralized trial. But there are other important components that are perhaps less frequently talked about, which are things like patient recruitment, home sample collection, as we saw in that last example, remote measures, using sensors and wearables becoming increasingly important, and of course the home nurse visits, which in some countries is certainly something that's very feasible and possible. So as we think about those components, let's explore opportunities as we design study protocols with an aim to enable this greater decentralization. So here is a typical schedule of events that we might see in a typical protocol. And some things we aim to measure more frequently, as you can see by the more ticks in that matrix, and others less frequently. So as we work down the list, we can look for opportunities to make certain measurements outside of the clinic environment. In fact, some of these measures we already measure remotely. So many of the clinical outcome assessments like daily diaries and quality of life instruments you can see down the bottom there, we already do those things remotely at home. We provide technology or have patients use their own smartphones or tablets to collect that data. Others we can consider remote approaches for. So in the COA section, things like the ClinROs, the clinician reported outcomes, and the performance outcomes, it may be that we can consider remote approaches to those. Other things on this list are perhaps not really suitable for at-home measurements. We've got things like imaging down at the bottom there. And in these cases, as we start to design this measurement schedule, of course, we need to measure things at the frequency that we need to get the information that we need. But equally, we can think about measuring certain things alongside other measures so that we can limit the number of visits that a patient will physically need to be at the clinic for. So in this example, we've got the ECG measurement, for example, being conducted on the same visit as the medical imaging. And those two things are perhaps easier to do at clinic. It's also clear by looking at this schedule of events that some of the routine follow-up assessments, like changes to concomitant medication or reviewing new and existing adverse events, can be quite possible done virtually, for example, using a video visit. So we'll not focus on those, but what we will do is in the next few slides, just take a little look at some of the other areas, the ones that I've numbered down the side there from 1 to 5. And we'll go through those individually. So let's take a look first at the medication piece, medication dispensing. Typically, there's two ways this can be achieved. There's the site to patient approach, or there's the depot to patient approach. And you can see them there. The top one, the site to patient model, we're stocking sites with medication as normal, and when they dispense, they're actually responsible for arranging that last mile logistics of the medication by courier to provide the medication to the patient at their home. Well, this provides a level of flexibility because actually what it means is patients could come in to receive their medication, or they could have it shipped, and that could even be decided on a visit-by-visit basis. So that's kind of a nice amount of flexibility. It also keeps the supply chain management simple because we're dispensing to the patient always using the stock that we're holding at site, and so we're only managing that patient stock in one place. If you look lower down, the second model, the depot to patient model, this is when the site dispenses medication and then the depot or the central pharmacy receive an instruction to then ship that medication, and they're responsible for shipping that medication direct to the patient. This keeps things simpler for the site, but it can make the supply chain more complicated if we want to have a mix of patients coming to site as requested, or if they would like to receive their medication, and also electing to receive some dispensations at home. So when you've got that mix, you're actually needing to manage stock levels in two different locations, and that becomes a little more complex. Associated with both of these approaches, of course, is the medications return process. And so in some cases, we can accommodate that with the same courier who's responsible for providing the medication to the patient. Now, they can pick up the used medication packs from the last dispensation and bring them back and return them to the central facility for tablet counting, etc. So again, moving down that list of things that were on the schedule of events, we had vital signs, and we actually had ECG as well. So if you think about vital signs measurements, there's actually plenty of high quality devices that can be used in a sort of self-use or at home setting for things like blood pressure and heart rate and blood oxygen, etc. And many of these devices have got Bluetooth connectivity, so it means we can receive these measures in near real time and enable good oversight and good monitoring remotely of that patient. We could even use telemedicine at times if we want to observe the patient as they make those measurements, just to make sure they're using the devices correctly and in the right way. We think about ECG. I think that's a little bit more difficult to obtain clinically accurate measures with devices that are currently on the market for self-use. So in this case, we might think, well, actually, the clinic visit is the best way to do this, or a nurse visiting at home to do this, perform this assessment, or maybe having the patient visit a local health care facility rather than travel the greater distance into perhaps the city hospital. It sort of leads us on to think about how we select devices that we want to use in clinical research. And I think there's a number of things that help us define a fit-for-purpose device. And you can see them down the left there in those assessment criteria. So obviously, safety and accuracy is vitally important. And what's interesting really as we think about this is, of course, devices in certain devices need a market clearance to be used in a particular territory. And that market clearance may need to satisfy certain accuracy requirements. So, for example, for blood pressure monitors and blood glucose meters, they have to satisfy a certain accuracy standard. But there might be a difference in the accuracy that's acceptable for personal health monitoring and the accuracy that we actually need for clinical measurements that are going to be used in regulatory decision making. So while something may have market clearance, we need to look carefully at picking devices that have got superior accuracy and reliability. There are, of course, technical considerations to think about. So in terms of, for example, how we integrate these devices to make sure we can access the data easily and provide this remote oversight for the patient. I think another consideration is what sort of market coverage has that device got? And when we consider the fact we need to ship these devices globally into multiple countries when we're running these global clinical trials. And so making sure we've got good market coverage is a really nice feature. There are ways around that, of course, but far more easier to get things into countries if they've got market coverage in those territories. And then I think maybe the last one to talk about here is usability properties. A device has got to be easy to use if we are expecting patients to use them themselves. And you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, this is some results of some usability testing that we conducted on 3 different blood pressure monitors. And while all devices actually were fine in terms of usability, we wouldn't have had a problem using any of these 3. We had quite an unexpected result that one device came out as being just far more preferred and far more easier to operate without assistance than the others. And it was interesting that one had a different cuff design. It was a hard, stiff cuff. And so users found it was easier to get that into the right position and hold it in position while they operated the device when they were doing that themselves without any help. So that was an interesting finding, I think, for us. So important to make sure that we're choosing devices that meet those criteria if we're going to measure things like vital signs and other things using sensors and wearables out in the field. We talked a little bit, or at least on that scheduler event, there were things like blood samples, and we've already talked about other types of samples that patients might provide, and using an app, for example, to provide the training around correct sample procedure, but also to facilitate the courier piece of collecting that sample. I think many of us have probably experienced, postal blood kits through this COVID pandemic. So the example there on the left is an antibody test kit where you use a finger prick test, but you use multiple finger pricks to produce a volume of blood that's required for that particular antibody test, and that can go then back in the post. And there are various devices and solutions available for both microsampling and also sampling larger volumes of blood on a self-use basis that we could consider for use, I think, in clinical trials moving forward. So I suppose the question here is, we don't always have to consider that where blood samples are involved, it's not always going to be the case that it would be a necessity for the patient to attend a clinic visit, perhaps. And then finally, ClinRows. So, when we talk about ClinRows, ClinRows are subjective assessments or ratings of the patient by the clinicians. It stands for clinician reported outcome. And we use these a lot in clinical trials, and in some diseases, actually, these are primary endpoints. So things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, many of the CNS conditions, these are primary endpoints that are assessed through a patient interview often by the investigator. And when we think about performing these remotely, we think about translating sort of face-to-face assessments with ones conducted perhaps over a video consultation. And as we think about the suitability of telemedicine to do those assessments, we have to consider two things. The first is the target population, and then the second is the measure itself. And as we think about the population considerations, there was actually an interesting recent paper that was published not very long ago. It was actually in the COVID pandemic, and it looked at what it called telemedicine unreadiness amongst older adults in the USA, and that was as a result of the changing of sort of routine care practices during the pandemic. And the study looked at factors that they felt important in influencing whether individual patients were ready for telemedicine consultations. And some factors included whether there was a younger carer or a younger family member around in the household who could perhaps help navigate the technology on behalf of that person, and also a measure of that patient's current technology interaction. So things like how often they were using things like email or sending SMS text messages or using the internet over the past month. And I think actually one thing we've seen through the pandemic has been reported in other places is a rising use of technology and things like Zoom and FaceTime and WhatsApp by older people, increasingly so to remain connected with families, etc. But I think these factors that they've identified, may well be helpful flags to help us identify patients that can struggle with technology more than others. But I think the difference when we do this in a clinical trial is we pre-plan this use of telemedicine, and we accompany that with both providing the technology into that home to make sure they have the right tools, but also provide training around that technology. And in some patient groups, that could include training of the caregiver. And, there's certainly good examples of where telemedicine has been used effectively to make clinical assessments in older populations. So in this example, we've got various verbal and written cognitive tests that were administered and observed successfully over video in adults with mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's up to the age of 82 years old. And I think the mean age is just over 70 years old. And interestingly, some of these tests were written. So like the clock drawing test, for example, the patient would be asked to draw the time on the particular clock face. And when they'd done, they would hold the picture up to the camera so the investigator could look at that and they could review it and score that particular assessment for the patient. I think as we start to think about the suitability of the measure, for whether we can migrate it from a face-to-face site-based assessment to a video-based telemedicine assessment, we need to think about actually what is being measured. And a couple of good examples here which show the difference. So the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, like other rating scales in depression, this asks the investigator to go through a semi-structured interview with the patient. It takes 20 to 25 minutes. They're assessing, I think in the case of the Hamilton Depression, 19 different aspects of depression for which they tease out a score for each one of those different items. And then the overall sum of those items, the sum of those scores, is the total HAM-D score. It's a measure of the severity of disease. And that's a pretty standard way to do it. And all of that can be assessed through conversation, through an interview. And in fact, the non-verbal aspects that the investigator might pick up on, so things like, the facial expression, the speaking rate, the intonation, all of those kind of things, they can assess those just as well on a video screen as they can face-to-face. If we consider the Parkinson's disease, the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, the UPDRS, there are aspects of that which would fit in the same category as the HAM-D in terms of ease of use over video. But there's other things that you have to assess as part of that rating scale, like muscle rigidity, for example, which are going to be impossible to measure without actually being able to touch the patient and touch their muscles, I suppose. Unless perhaps we had some sort of device that could do some sort of measurement, but we don't have that. So at this point, a UPDRS is going to be far more difficult and probably not suitable to do over a video, whereas a Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, we feel very comfortable. And so, again, we need to examine carefully the contents of these instruments before we determine whether they're suitable for use in a video environment. And it might be that we choose different scales and different instruments if we want to do a decentralized trial, because we want to make sure that we're keeping within the confines of what is sensible and possible to measure through that video consultation. Well, here's an example of a comparison of at-home and at-clinic measurements for one particular clinician-reported outcome. And we're looking here at a statistic called the mean square successive difference. And that's a good measure of reliability in data that has a gradual change. So the sorts of data we might expect, that's a property we might expect in something with a typical clinician-reported outcome. And in this plot, you can see that the darker boxes, we've got at the top in the blue, we've got rest of world, and in the grey, we've got US, the bottom two boxes. And the darker of the two are the in-person assessments, and the lighter of the two are the remote video-based assessments. And I think you can see that the parameter, this mean square successive difference, is broadly similar between the two groups. And this, combining that with other analyses, is a good indicator that both measurement approaches have got similar reliability. So a good property and good evidence of acceptability via video. I think the final thing that we had on that list were performance outcomes. So an example of a performance outcome might be a 6-minute walking test, and that's usually a corridor walking test that you might do, ask a patient to do in clinic, supervised with a nurse walking alongside. And the outcome measure is how far they're able to walk in that 6-minute timed interval. The definition from the best glossary of a performance outcome is a measurement based on a standardized task actively undertaken by a patient according to a set of instructions. A PERFO, which is a performance outcome assessment, may be administered by an appropriately trained individual or completed by the patient independently. And that last bit is a revision to the existing PERFO definition, and really a result of this sort of drive towards using technologies and sensors and wearables to deliver performance outcome tests outside of the clinic in an unsupervised setting. And one way we can do this is using smartphones. And the smartphone we already provide to patients often to collect their patient-reported outcomes data using an app on that smartphone. Well, that same app can actually be used to access the various sensors that sit on board that smartphone. So you have things like, an accelerometer in the smartphone, and the original purpose, of course, of that accelerometer was that to detect when you've rotated the phone between landscape and portrait, so that it can flip the screen to display the appropriate landscape or portrait view of the screen. And yet, of course, that's the same accelerometer that we get inside, the Fitbits and the Garmins and these other activity trackers. And so we can start to leverage those sensors, like the accelerometer or the gyroscope or the GPS, for purposes to measure health-related outcomes with performance tests. And some good examples, sorry, let's go back. Some good examples I've got listed down there of apps that have done this. So the 6-minute walking test, this was the My Heart Counts study by Stanford, which was in thousands of patients in the USA. And some other ones with various pharmaceutical companies have been developing different performance outcome tests, again, using the sensors in the smartphone to measure various things. But I think as we think about measurement and the kind of the focus of this talk, when are performance tests equivalent when we're doing them at clinic versus when we're doing them at home? And by equivalent, we're saying, well, we might be able to live with a little more variability in an assessment if we're doing it at home, because we might be able to do it more frequently. And so actually we have probably a more powerful statistical test to be able to distinguish between treatment groups. But what we don't want is some sort of bias or difference, a systematic difference in the measurement that we're making between those two. So if we consider a 6-minute walking test as an example. So in clinic, we conduct that test. We've got a nurse who is encouraging the patient to go as fast as they can. And of course, they're there, they're supervising them, they're there to help if the patient gets into trouble. So you're kind of looking at more like a peak functional capacity. It's the furthest you could walk in 6 minutes. If you did a test remotely, you give somebody an app, and it's going to measure using the GPS how far they can walk in 6 minutes. You're not likely to be asking them to do their peak functional capacity. You're more likely to be measuring a comfortable distance that they can walk in that 6 minutes. Now, you might still see over time improvements in that distance, but you're not measuring quite the same thing as you are in clinic. Whereas if you think of something like a timed up and go test, this is where somebody has to get out of their seat, they walk a few meters, they turn around, they walk back and sit back down, and normally the investigator would have a stopwatch to time that whole event. If we do that remotely, there's going to be a bit more variability there. They may not always walk the same distance. It may not always be exactly the same distance between patients. But does that matter? Are we measuring the same thing? We perhaps are. Interestingly, when we start to put sensors in to help measure this test, so maybe we put an accelerometer onto each ankle and have the patient do this test, we can actually get even deeper insights and new, more pertinent endpoints from the data than we can from simply the amount of time it takes them to complete the whole event. And an example would be that 180-degree turn that the patient has to do. How many steps do they take and how balanced are they in performing that turn? And that can tell us much more about things like their risk of falling than the actual length of time to complete the task might do. So as we start to think about instrumenting some of these performance outcomes, it may well be that we start to explore new endpoints which are more pertinent and more interesting than perhaps the original ones were. So there's a growing regulatory interest in the use of wearables and sensors, and certainly a growing interest across the industry from sponsors in how we leverage these to measure interesting things in our clinical trials. But I think the question here around sensors and wearables is how do we develop and deliver novel clinical endpoints? And there's certainly a growing regulatory interest in new endpoints derived from wearables and sensors. So you can see here on the left, the FDA, for example, have got a number of endpoints in various stages of development within their eCOA qualification program. And actually all the examples listed there are to do with activity monitor endpoints. And then in addition, on the right-hand side, the EMA, for example, qualified an endpoint for use in COPD. And this is the proactive measure. And this is a composite endpoint. It's derived by combining patient-reported outcomes data with activity monitor data. And so you can see that there is certainly growing interest amongst the regulators, as of course there is amongst us as clinical trialists. And there's a number of things that we should consider when we're thinking about using a wearable or a sensor to collect clinical endpoint data in clinical trials. So as we move across these, the first, does the wearable help us to measure one of the study's concepts of interest? So we don't want to just include a wearable because it would be a cool thing to do. We want to make sure that it's helping us to address one of the study objectives as a measurement tool. Secondly, how do we select a device that regulators will accept the data from? Third, how do we implement the device within our study? So, for example, how long should it be worn and where should it be worn to get the right measures for whatever we're interested in? Fourthly, how do we manage the data that the device provides? And then finally, and quite important actually, I think, can I compare the endpoint data captured using different devices? And if we think about the patient-reported outcomes side of our business, of industry rather, we've gone to a lot of lengths to make sure that when we've got a validated questionnaire like a quality of life instrument, an SF36 or an EQ5D, we've validated that when we move that from paper on a single sheet of paper to a handheld device with multiple pages, that the way that patients answer that has not been changed. In other words, the measurement properties of that instrument have been conserved. Well, the same is the question about wearables, I suppose. Can we be sure that if we use a different wearable to measure the same endpoint, that we've got a comparability or equivalence in that endpoint? So could a regulator, for example, compare the same endpoint that we might measure on one drug development program with a different sponsor's drug development program where they've used a different device to measure it? Well, we're going to just, for the interest of time, we're just going to touch on the first two of these areas just briefly as we consider how to develop novel endpoints. And I think maybe just to start with, good endpoints should map to our study's concepts of interest. And as an example of this, a few years ago, I performed a review of studies looking at measuring activity in COPD patients using an activity monitor. And my idea was I could do a review to derive a consensus standard for methodology in looking at activity in these patients. But what I found was that, I looked at 76 studies that I reviewed, and of those 76 studies, when I looked at the endpoints they reported, there were 80 different clinical endpoints that they reported. So really no consensus, which is quite confusing when you think about, we're studying the same patient population here. Now, in no case did the authors provide significant rationale for the selection of the endpoints that they reported. And in no cases did they report researching with patients what aspects of activity were most important to them before selecting the endpoints that they studied. And this really is very different and quite at variance to the approach of patient-focused drug development that we're encouraged to follow, and that the FDA, for example, are developing their 4 guidances on. So in the paper that the DIA study endpoints community developed, it was published last year, we looked at the evidence that should be compiled to support the use of a novel endpoint derived from sensor data. So I definitely recommend taking a look at that. It's open access. You can get a free copy of that data, that paper from the Contemporary Clinical Trials website. A key part of ensuring the endpoint of the evidence needed to support the novel endpoint is ensuring that the endpoint is meaningful to patient and that the wearable itself is a good solution to measure that. And how should we do that? Well, let's consider this example of COPD, and this is a hypothetical example. But if we were to interview COPD patients about the kinds of activity that might be most meaningful to them, they might say things like, on the left there, I'd like to do more for myself around the house. Or they might say, I want to be able to walk my grandchild to and from school. Sorry, yeah, just clicking that. Right, there we go. So we can relate those activities to 2 different meaningful aspects of health. So the first we might relate to being more sedentary behavior related, and the second to be more physical activity related. And if we think of the sedentary behavior related elements, we might be able to consider those in terms of sedentary behaviour. We might think about time spent sitting or lying, or we might think about the number of times you actually get up from seated or from lying. So sit to stand transitions, for example. So they might be concepts of interest that help us to measure that meaningful aspect of health around sedentary behaviour. Equally, we can look at the physical activity related concepts of interest. So, for example, we're talking here about patients who are relatively inactive, and they're talking about short bouts of walking. So it might be that we can define, a purposeful walking episode, and we could look at how many of those episodes that they are able to conduct each day. Or we might be able to add up the total time they spend in purposeful walking episodes. And those might be pertinent concepts of interest that measure that meaningful aspect of health, such as I want to be able to walk my grandchild to and from school. So if we now think about an endpoint, maybe perhaps related to that purposeful walking episode, we might say, well, that is, the number of purposeful walking episodes. I could define it as the number of bouts of activity per day with a cadence or a stepping rate of at least 60 steps a minute. So that means I'm continuing some momentum in my stepping, but it's not a very fast walk, and a duration of perhaps at least 2 minutes. Now, again, those are just hypothetical. We need to think about what that definition would be, but as an example. And I think really it's only at this point that we can decide, well, what's the best way to measure that endpoint? We might decide that we can use a patient diary to measure some of this stuff. But I think if we look at this one, it would certainly be logical to consider that a wearable device might be the best approach to be able to measure something as technical and precise as that. And so we might say, yeah, okay, so that leads us to the measurement choice would be using a mobile sensor. And I need, because I'm interested in purposeful walking episodes, I need to be able to detect steps, and I need to be able to detect the timing of those steps so I can work out the stepping rate. And if I can do those things accurately, then perhaps that's the best way to make that measurement and to measure that concept of interest in that trial. And this now brings us to that topic of what evidence do we need to support the endpoint, this novel endpoint. So if we start at the top, analytical validity, we need to show that the sensor itself is sufficiently accurate, and we need to provide data to support that. That's analytical validity data. Then if we look at the endpoint itself, we need to have data to support the endpoint properties, or at least to help us understand the endpoint properties. So is it sensitive enough to detect change? And what magnitude of change could we define as being clinically relevant? And then we need to know we need to be able to show that the concept of interest actually represents the meaningful aspect of health. So this is content validity. And we need to be able to show that we're truly measuring things that are meaningful to patients. And this is the bottom thing there, that the patient-focused research. And so we should apply this thinking, whenever we consider developing a new endpoint or a novel endpoint for our clinical trials. So I think just to finish off, I've got just two more topics actually, and I think the first is around data aggregation, and I think it's an important topic and maybe one we don't talk about very much. And as we collect more and more data from an increasing variety of data sources, we're challenged really with how we manage and aggregate the data from multiple sources effectively and in a timely manner throughout our clinical trial. And this slide illustrates, some of the sort of growing magnitude of the problem. So I think, decentralization, DCTs, bring with them a drive to collect data from an increasing number of data sources. And already over 50% of studies include at least 5 data sources. We've got 37% of studies including between 6 and 10 data sources. and 13% of studies with 11 or more data sources. Incredible number. And we're seeing that this number is projected to continue to grow rapidly. And we're already, in fact, at the point of inflection where we collect more data outside of our EDC systems than we do within EDC. And that quote there on the right-hand side, as this head of data management indicates, managing and aggregating all the external data in a timely manner throughout a clinical trial is a huge challenge. And I think this is where data aggregation solutions have an important role to play. They are able to bring in disparate data sources, whether it be structured or unstructured data, and they're able to map them and transform them, put them in a data lake where they can be mapped and aggregated and cleaned. And the aggregated data provides us the ability to then monitor those combined data sources as the study is progressing. So if we can enable rapid data aggregation in real time, we can then enable things like comprehensive medical review, data management review, risk-based quality monitoring, etc., all with the data in one place, as well, of course, of exporting data in the formats that we need it for our statisticians and data managers to use downstream. And I think maybe this is a final thing just to sort of note is that we focus this rightly on the patient. And of course, that's our drive for why we're thinking about decentralizing trials is to make the participation in those studies more convenient. But what's been interesting is, particularly through COVID, we've seen decentralization for other players and stakeholders in the clinical trial process, and one being, of course, the CRA. And so we've been using and leveraging virtual the virtual glasses. I think the video glasses that I talked about earlier, we've been using those, for example, to facilitate facility inspections. So the CRA can watch a real-time streaming from the site. The clinical study coordinator will perhaps wear the glasses, walk around the site, do a tour, allow the CRA to get a close look at various things, and perform that remote visit. Now I did have a video here, and sadly, I can't play that. So that's a shame. I'm sure you can imagine what it'd be like. I've basically just got a video there showing the view that the CRA gets going into a facility, looking at a centrifuge, looking at some of the certification and the testing data associated with that centrifuge, and performing that facility inspection. So I think, again, as we think about decentralization, we can think about the other players in the clinical trial process as well, and how we can make their lives more efficient and easier to conduct some of the activities they need to do in a decentralized manner. So just to summarize, we've got many tools available to us as an industry to enable aspects of decentralization. Enabling accurate and reliable measurements of safety and efficacy remains of paramount importance. That's the kind of primary thing we're interested in. We have to think about population considerations and measure properties when we think about translating things into remote settings, as opposed to the face-to-face in-clinic assessments that we're used to. But not all endpoints that we capture remotely are going to be equivalent to our legacy site-based assessments, and those might be our gold standards. So we're going to have to think about how we deal with that. It may well be that we're capturing things that are more pertinent and more interesting in the remote setting, but there may be some work to do to validate those endpoints. And as we collect data from more and more sources of data, we need effective real-time data aggregation. That becomes vital to us to be able to monitor our trials on an ongoing basis and deal with that volume of data. And then finally, as I just mentioned, it isn't just necessarily about patients. We can decentralize for CRAs and perhaps some other players as well as we think about that. So I think that's taken me to the end of my presentation, so I'm really happy to hand back to Louisa and see if there's been any questions online.
Great. That's great. Thank you for an excellent presentation. We've received a few questions already, but we'll give the rest of you a moment to enter your questions in the Q&A box to the left of the slides. Before we begin the Q&A, I'll run through some brief announcements. First, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors for sponsoring this digital week. Next, I'd like to introduce a brand new event to the Clinical Trials Series for 2022. It's a Decentralized Clinical Trials hybrid event, which is taking place March the 7th to the 10th. It offers a fully hybrid learning and networking opportunity with live in-person experience taking place March the 7th to the 9th in Miami, Florida, and the digital experience taking place March the 7th to the 10th. Further details can be found on our website. Also, be sure to check out the resources list to the right of your screen where you can download featured articles. Now back to Bill for the Q&A. So first question, were there any issues with the home visiting nurses not showing up to patients' homes for the PEDI injection study? Were they timed doses?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Now, it was only a small study, and I don't think there were any issues, but you're right to bring that up. I mean, that is certainly something we need to think about and we need to mitigate. I'm not aware of any issues, but it's a great question. And of course, if they were timed doses, then the timing of that visit is absolutely critical. So, yeah, I think there weren't, but I agree that that's an issue we need to think about carefully when we're designing our trials. So great point.
In home sampling, are there any regulatory concerns that the sample was collected properly and that it was indeed the patient's sample?
Yeah, isn't that a good question? And I think that's right. I mean, we it's the same in fact with wearables and sensors. We worry that someone's going to give their activity monitor to their young child and find that their activity profile for the day has gone out the roof. So, yeah, I think of course there's no guarantee of that, and we need to, but perhaps it's similar to if a patient needs to bring a stool sample into clinic, usually they'll do that at home and bring it in rather than be asked to produce one at clinic. So I don't think there's any difference there, but I suppose we need to make sure that we've trained the patients, we've explained the importance, and we try and mitigate that problem as best we can. But it's a good question. I would say in that case, it really isn't necessarily always an issue with whether you do it at home or not with decentralization, because often those samples will be produced at home anyway. Yeah, great question.
Okay. How do you define the central pharmacy, the clinic's pharmacy? Usually pharmacies are not willing to manage shipments to patients, and requests from site staff do take up the responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I wasn't defining the central pharmacy as the clinic's pharmacy. So you're right. If we were doing site to patient shipment of medication, if it was from a hospital site, it may well be the hospital pharmacy that's holding that medication. We have found that institutions have been willing to do that throughout COVID, but we agree with the person asking the question. We think that this is going to be something that sites don't really want to be doing. It's a lot of burden for them. So the central pharmacy is really it's really a depot that has got a qualified pharmacist associated with it. So somebody who is responsible and able to fulfil that dispensation to the patient, but from the depot facility.
Okay. Does Signant Health have an in-home nursing service, or is that outsourced?
Yeah, we work with partners to provide things like that. So there are aspects of decentralization that we don't do, and so couriers and home nurses certainly fall into those categories. So we would work with industry-leading organisations who provide those kind of services, and I'm sure people on the call know a number of solution providers, and they're the people that we work with. We wouldn't do that ourselves.
With multiple DCT vendors' device collecting data, who is central point of truth for the data? Who defines what the data means, i.e. what is adherence and what is engagement?
I'm just trying to understand that question. So the central point of truth for the data. So I think if I'm understanding that correctly, you know, for me, it's like, well, where is the source of the data? Which system is the originator of the data? So, you know, you might have one source of data that's collected somewhere, and then it's sort of transferred somewhere else, and it ends up in a database somewhere else. But the source system is the original system, and that's kind of the point of truth, I suppose, for the data. And I think it will be important to be able to identify the source of truth, or the source of the originator of each data point that we collect in our trials. I'm not quite sure if I've answered that question because I didn't completely understand it, but I think maybe that's gone some way towards answering that, Louisa.
Okay, great. Next question: what is Signant House geographic footprint?
Yeah, so global. So you know, we operate in. I can tell I'm not a sales guy, right? So I'd be able to rattle these stats off, but I think there's sort of like 90 countries or something, and a similar number of languages. So I mean, we're used to operating across the globe in different parts of Europe, different parts of North and South America, APAC. You know, yes. So we have a large geographic footprint. Sorry, I can't answer that more completely.
Okay. How much longer will SDTM be the data model for this work? Isn't OMOP more valuable for an even broader set of research purposes?
Yeah, so I think that's in reflection to the data aggregation slide that I brought up, and I did have SDTM as an example of a data model, and it doesn't have to be that. And in fact, when you use a data lake, you actually don't have to define the kind of schema up front. You have the data in a fairly flexible format, and then you export it into different formats that are going to be useful to you. So SDTM was just an example of a data model, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be whatever you want it for the purpose that you're going to use that data for. Again, hope that answers that question, but happy to follow up later if it doesn't.
Okay. Which entity is responsible for the courier services? Are pharmacies already set up for the medication delivery services, particularly interested in the US?
Well, in our experience, we've been using, sort of specialist last mile providers. So people like Marken, people like World Courier, and the like are the ones that we engage with, and kind of set those systems in place so that sites or pharmacies can use those, to manage those direct-to-patient shipments.
Okay, I think last question. You talk about sensors and accuracy and measurement precision between devices, for example, in activity measures. Is your thinking constrained by how we have historically done things and what we need to measure in not an absolute number, but the change in activity levels at the individual level, assuming they use the same sensor throughout the trial?
Yeah, okay. So that, I mean, I get that point, and I think there's certainly merit in that. So I think what the question is asking there is, aren't we more interested in a relative change rather than an absolute value? And so if a sensor's measuring, different sensors are measuring slightly differently, does that matter? But I think it still does matter, particularly when we start to look at things like what is a meaningful change, and to define a meaningful change, it's usually it might be a change of 1,000 steps a day, or something we might say is meaningful to that particular patient population. And if we've got something that's measuring 30% more steps, it feels to me like we need to be able to define the tolerance we're willing to accept between measures, to be able to be confident that the endpoint that we're measuring and its interpretation can be regarded as equivalent. But I think it's a good point, and it's worthy of some more thinking around that.
Okay, that's great. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. This session was recorded, and you'll receive a notification in 24 hours when the on-demand session is available for viewing. Please take a moment to complete the feedback form so we can continue to improve your Digital Week experience. Thank you for a great session, and on behalf of Informa Connect Life Sciences, have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.